What's the creepiest / most unexplainable thing that's ever happened to you? Lots of weird shit. I'm a scientist and all, but the house I grew up in is probably haunted. Weirdest thing? From as early as I could remember, I could see a thing outside my window. I can still see it clear as day. It looked like an orange, cartoon Y version of an elk's head. It had a dewlap in the shape of a children's illustration of a crescent moon, which had a face. I always saw it in side view, and both of its eyes were always looking at me. It only appeared at night. This thing terrified me, but I never thought to bring it up to my parents. I don't know why. Finally, when I was about 6, I told them. My grandmother had been reading me a story in my room at night, and the thing had been there the whole time. I noticed, she didn't. That's when I realized that this was not normal, and went to my parents for help. They covered the window with a towel, and I didn't see it again for about 1.5 years when curiosity got the better of me. I lifted the towel, and saw it again. That's when I decided to never lift that towel again, and it was the last time I saw it. It's been years now, but that room still gives me the heebie-jeebies. I know I didn't make this shit up because I saw it all the time. But now the towel's down and I still don't see it if I go in there at night. I never saw it per se, but I always felt like I had a vivid memory of it staring in at me from my bedroom window. If I thought about it, I would remember it vividly and not be able to face the window for the rest of the night. Like if I looked too long he might appear. It was a small humanoid creature, very thin, with a face somewhere between an ape and a man, with a small flattish nose and large black eyes. It was covered in white fur except for its face, and its skin was also white. I only remember the torso since my window was up a ways from the ground. So either he was very tall and skinny or was standing on something. In my memory he was just standing there, looking at me with a cold, expressionless gaze. Like I was only something to observe that evoked no emotion. It was very creepy, and I can't think of any movie or anything that got it into my head. I can't remember when I started remembering him. I always wondered if anyone had ever seen anything like it. I used to see what I called the dog with the heart-shaped head. It was a black, cartoonish-looking dog, but the head was just shaped more like a heart. It had no face, just evil-looking eyes that glowed yellow. I saw it all the time, almost like it would follow me places. From ages 5 to 8 or so, I would tell all my relatives about it because the thing scared the hell out of me. Of course they all laughed and thought it was just an overactive imagination. I haven't thought about it for years and years, but this post reminded me. I was in a car accident a while back. I was physically fine, mentally not so much. My car was completely destroyed. I called my family to come get me and take me home, and I decided to call out sick to work the next day to take care of the affairs with insurance and stuff. It's been maybe an hour or two since the accident when I call my boss, who actually lives in another city 25 miles away. My work is there too. She'd already heard through the grapevine about it, not as paranormal or spooky as some other posts, but for those few minutes before it hit me how she found out, I was so creeped out about it. 20 minutes after I proposed to my a girl from high school that neither of us had had any contact with in over 4 years congratulated me through a text message. We hadn't told anyone yet, not even our parents. When I was a teenage hippie guy, I used to wear this piece pendant around my neck all the time. So, this one day I'm getting ready for a shower and getting undressed. I'm about to step in the tub when I unhook the piece pendant. The pendant slid off the chain and fell on the floor behind me. I turned around to pick it up and it was gone. Completely vanished. Missing. I tore that bathroom apart looking for it. It didn't make sense to me because I heard it hit the floor and it was nowhere in sight. So, several years later we're redoing the bathroom floor, and as we're tearing up the old linoleum, there's my piece pendant underneath the floor. When we were in the Scouts, my friend found a lightning stick. Wherever he pointed it, lightning would hit. He whirled it on top of his head, then hit it on the ground, and the lightning hit like 10 feet away. I still have no idea how he was able to play that off. One of the other kids got jealous and broke the stick. There's a huge oak tree on my parents' property. When I was a kid, I remember students would come and do studies on it to give you reference of how big the sucker was. Last I heard it was 115 feet tall and almost 5 feet wide. That's really tall for an oak. Smarter people can confirm. Anyway, it was when I was in 5th or 6th grade, and around October, all the leaves were off the tree. One morning my dad gets up and lets out the dogs as he usually does. The dogs start going crazy and wake me up and I go outside. It's still dark but I could tell something was peculiar. The tree was covered in turkey vultures, and I mean covered. I honestly think 200 or so. There were so many that the wildlife department came to our house. They actually came 4 times in 2 days because people driving by were confused and calling. There were so many vultures in our tree that you couldn't see a branch. We couldn't let the dogs outside, and none of them were flying. They all just sat there staring at us for 2 days. On the 3rd day we woke up and there were no vultures in the tree. It was crazy. I still remember all the grass under the tree's branches died because the vultures shit so much. Weirder even. My parents have never seen a turkey vulture near the property since. Sorry if that was long. I'm not a great natural storyteller, and it happened 15 years ago, but that was some weird shit to witness. About 2 weeks ago someone rode the elevator with me and was carrying a gun. He showed it to me and proceeded to criticize the inadequacy of the security guards for not detecting it at the casino. I still don't know how I managed to restrain myself from overreacting and rolling with the situation. The guy looked overly excited as well, almost as if under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Then I left the elevator and I felt he was going to shoot me in the back or something, but apparently it wasn't my time yet. When I was about 12 my appendix got removed, and about a week after the operation, I had to go back to the hospital since I probably had an infection. They are very common for appendix removal. I was in the waiting room with my dad, and after hours of waiting, Canada, free healthcare come with an abysmal waiting line. He went to get us something to eat because we're obviously staying there for a while. I stayed in the waiting room with other patients when a guy in a trench coat and shades comes to sit right beside me. I didn't pay much attention to it since I was focused on the magazine I was reading. But then after a couple minutes I noticed he then put his arm, the same cheesy yawning move we see guys do in movies. I was really uncomfortable and he told me to come with him because he knew a doctor so I wouldn't have to wait. Fortunately my dad came back at that moment and he got really close to this guy up. That was the first time I saw my dad being serious about hurting someone. The creepy part is that I'm 19 now, and in March this year I went to Boston with friends, and while we were in McDonald's, I saw this guy who kept staring at my group of friends, and I'm about 95% sure we both noticed each other because the moment he saw I noticed his staring, he got out that restaurant in 6th gear and flew off. Don't really have one for myself, but I do have one that happened to my dad when he was still in college. I don't recall some of the minor details, but I will try my best. My dad and a bunch of other people were going to some sort of swim meet as chaperones for a group of kids, and they were waiting for their bus to pick them up. Dad's minding his own business, watching the children messing around and whatnot, when he hears someone calling his name. He looks across the road, and there's an old man standing there. The man isn't that unusual looking, he has a long, white beard and plain attire, just a regular old fellow. But he has an intense stare, directly on my dad. The man starts walking across the road towards my dad, not even noticing the other people. And, according to Dad, no one else saw him, either. Some of the kids were playing tag and ran right by him without noticing. At this point my dad is scared, and the old man eventually stops right in front of him. He stares directly into my dad's eyes, and says, absolutely serious, "Be careful on that bus." After that, he just walks away. At that moment, the bus arrives to pick up my dad's group, so they all get on and drive off. A few minutes into the trip, the bus is driving along the side of a cliff, and the driver loses control. The guardrails couldn't hold, and the bus starts to nosedive off the ledge, but is actually stopped by a fucking tree root jutting out the side of the cliff wall. The other chaperones force open the back doors of the bus and successfully herd all of the kids out to safety, before evacuating themselves. The scary part? My dad was the last person to get out of that bus, mere seconds before the tree root snapped and sent the whole vehicle plummeting down the cliff. He never saw that mysterious old man again, but he still gets chills down his spine thinking about him. My mother is a primary school teacher in a rural town in Australia. About 10 years ago she was offered the principal position at a tiny mountain school an hour from where we lived. The mountain town was kind of a long-running joke for us townies, just mentioning it would cause any local to start humming the dueling banjos theme from Deliverance. The population was under 40 people, most of them had the same last name and were pretty well known for keeping it in the family. However, being promoted from teacher to principal was a big deal for Mom. So we decided that we'd all live at the old schoolhouse during the week and come back to civilization on the weekends. I had just finished high school and was waiting for university to start, so I spent most of my days in the old schoolhouse. There was always a lot of sudden and random old house noise that didn't sound like it was the house at all. Scratching, shuffling sounds at odd intervals that frequently sounded like footsteps or voices. I tried to pass it off as paranoia for as long as I could, but shit finally hit the fan one day when I stopped my tape mid-song, and distinctly heard a man's voice quietly whispering random numbers from the front veranda. 40. 40. 9. 40. 17. I ain't afraid of no ghosts, but I am afraid of hillbilly home invasion, so I took off to the school and reported it to my mother, who of course didn't believe me. Then to my father, who also didn't believe me. My sister did though. She said she hadn't slept well since she was awoken nights before by the sound of a tree branch scraping on her bedroom window, where there was no tree. She said she thought she had seen a man standing in the backyard late one night too, but when she mustered the courage to look again, he was gone. Pretty soon we were the first teenage sisters to ever insist that they should start sharing a room. My parents thought we were being ridiculous. However, one evening after dinner we were visited by two of the local men, who told them something that changed their mind. After asking if we'd had any trouble at the house, they proceeded to tell us that everyone else in town had been experiencing trouble now for over a month. Apparently a group of strange men dressed in makeshift camouflage gear had been seen wandering along the main street at night. It had come to the town's attention because, while the town was used to strangers in hunting gear, these guys were covered in leaves and grass and sticks stuck to regular clothes. No one knew who they were, not locals. There were at least 10 different guys, always traveling alone, always in the same weird clothing. At first the locals were having a laugh about it. It certainly wasn't common to see people dressed as walking bushes outside of a Warner Brothers cartoon even in hunting season. It was all very absurd and funny, at least until these guys started coming onto private property. One lady woke up to hear something moving under her house, shining a flashlight up through the floorboards. Another man came home to find a camouflaged man crouched on his roof. One man had heard muttering from his back porch, only to go out and discover that someone had unchained his, very large and intimidating, hunting dogs from their run and tied them to his back doorknob and drawn a large X in red chalk on the door. Pretty much every local had been terrorized by one of these guys in the night, and some of them in the day. The local guys warned my dad to keep things locked up and to be vigilant. Over the course of the next month similar events occurred. My mother even saw one of them men on the edge of the school grounds during the day and called the police. The sightings were frequent, as were the chalk X's. One of the locals even saw a man in the strange camouflage gear standing on his front lawn whimpering like an animal in the early hours of the morning. The local guy threatened him while his wife called the police, but the man silently stood his ground, smiling at them in the dark. The local man eventually lost his cool and beat the heck out of this creeper, who stood there smiling through the entire beating, then walked calmly back into the bush, still smiling and bleeding before the police arrived. Unfortunately, there isn't a cool ending to this story. The school closed not long after due to government funding cuts, and my mother got a new job closer to home, which meant we left pretty swiftly. We moved back home after spending only 5 months up in mountain country, and no one was too sorry about that. I often wonder who these guys were to be out in the middle of nowhere, and what they were doing exactly. TLDR, hill people dressed as walking bushes terrorize town. Somewhere, a lone banjo plays. You know, on The Matrix when it glitches and the exact thing repeats. That has happened to me multiple times. My parents coming home and then disappearing a few minutes before they actually got home and repeated the same greeting. It happened so much I ended up ignoring it. It was 3 a.m. or so in a San Diego apartment near UCSD. My friend and I are chilling on the living room. Roommate is sleeping on the room next door with door open like 1 feet. We suddenly hear the loudest, most intense male torture scream coming from our roommate's room. Lasted for about 7 to 10 seconds. It straight up sounded like somebody was getting chopped to pieces. After a few seconds of shock, we gathered our balls. I stood up, grabbed a knife from the kitchen and rushed in, expecting a serial killer in our dead roommate. Except he was sleeping like a baby facing down. Important because the scream wasn't muffled at all. He has no history of night terrors or sleeping problems. He wasn't sweating. We woke him up. He didn't hear anything and wasn't even having nightmares. I would rather see a ghost than hear that demonic torture scream again. Got the covers yanked off of me while no one but me was in the room. Occasionally the foot of the bed would vibrate, not hard, but noticeably. I always told myself that one was just my foot twitching, but I don't know. I would see shit in the dark corners of the room and out of the corners of my eyes. My stereo would turn on its own on full blast. Lights would turn on their own. I would hear footsteps when I was alone. I even remember hearing voices from the inside of my pillow. When I was too young to remember, apparently I would frequently go crying to my parents that something grabbed my leg while I was asleep. The funny thing is, all this happened whenever my mom still lived with us. After she left, the creepy shit stopped. She always says she's haunted and I've experienced it, so I believe her. Now I've had to move back in with her due to unfortunate circumstances. I'm worried it's going to start up again, and apparently creepy stuff still happens to her, so it seems likely. Well, basically, my uncle, who I was extremely close to, died when I was around 13. It hit me bad, as he was the closest thing to a father figure I had, but just after he died, he would keep appearing in my dreams. They were very strange. Before I even saw him, there would be no sound, everything would be bright, and it would just seem like a normal day. Then I would suddenly see my uncle, and I'd always have the same thought of, oh my god, he's alive, but then he'd always stop me and say stuff like he'll always be there for you, or tell me how much he'll miss me. Actually tearing up writing this, it felt extremely personal, and it'd be extremely aware. As if he was speaking directly to me, but the strangest part was, that I'd only ever see him in my dream, if I didn't pray that night. We Sikhs call it part, pronounced part, nights that I'd remember to do part, I'd have a normal dream, but nights that I didn't, there was a 100% chance of seeing him. And it's not as if I was subconsciously thinking about it, because I only realized this link weeks after it was happening. It got to the point where I would think to myself, I want to see him, and I wouldn't pray, and I'd see him. It was painful, but I felt so blessed just to see him again. After the dream, I'd usually wake up in the middle of the night, completely at peace. But then the reality would hit me that he wasn't actually alive and it was just a dream. It may sound silly, but I genuinely think he was trying to message me, and console me. Okay, so I'm going to write this down quick. One night me and my friend were cruising around the back roads. I live out in the country, and we stopped at a little spot to take a piss. Where we parked was on a big cliff overlooking the nice landscape. Off in the distance you could see the lights of some houses, but they were not close. After taking a leak, I stood on the edge of this cliff and started yelling really loud to hear my echo. This went on for a few minutes before I finally looked down and noticed that I could see the lights from a window of the house below me. I pointed this out to my friend and we both kind of laughed that I was being loud this whole time and there was someone living below us. We got back in his car and took off before we got any complaints. Skip to a few weeks later when we were in the same area, this time during the day. Stop at the same spot and I look down and there is literally nothing but rocks and bushes down there. No way a house could even be built in that kind of area. Spooked us good. When I was about 14-15, my bed was right next to a window in my room. The bed didn't have a headboard, so it was just my pillows against the window screen and windowsill. The window lever was a turn crank. It wasn't the windows that lifted up or pulled to the side. Anyway, I was sleeping one night and I heard in my head a very demonic voice saying, "Just do it, slam your head and end it." So in my sleep I felt my head come up and slam down onto the window turn crank. It hit right in the middle of my forehead. I woke up immediately and went to the bathroom mirror and my forehead was bleeding down my face. I don't know what that voice was in my head, but it definitely wasn't me, and I haven't heard it since. Was sitting up in bed meditating, looking at my paper ball lampshade, mid-morning. And it totally crumpled in on one side as I watched, pretty wigged out. We had just moved into a new home. My parents and my brother had left for the weekend, which meant I was home alone for a couple days. On the side of the house were a bunch of big logs from a tree that we had pulled out of the backyard. When I woke up the next morning, a couple of huge heavy pieces of the chopped down tree were by my back door standing upright. That was 10 years ago and I still get creeped out by it. On a normal Wednesday night it is about time for me to go to bed. I stayed up a little later than normal and it was about 11:20. I grab my dog to take her out to pee. As she is doing her business I noticed a helicopter with a searchlight on heading towards me. The searchlight is scanning all around the neighborhood and eventually lands on me. The searchlight hangs on me for about 5 seconds as I look up and then it turns off. Without any other lights, I hear the helicopter fly over me and off into the darkness. When I was a little kid, I thought I saw a face in the window looking in. It was a little window above a big dining room window, which put it something like 8 feet above the floor inside, or 12 feet above the ground outside. I always thought it was my imagination, until recently when my brother told me he remembered being in the yard and seeing a face looking out the same window. I was lying in bed at 3 in the morning, when I heard the most tremendous bang. This wasn't like something falling off a table. Something blunt hit a wall very hard, and I felt the house vibrate. I thought someone was breaking in, and I went slowly downstairs with an old hockey stick. Not only did no one else hear it, but I went outside the next day expecting to find a brick or damaged wall, but there was nothing. When I was 11 years old, I was on vacation with my family in El Salvador visiting the rest of the family. Where they lived, it was straight up third world. The small town is located in a valley. Mountains surrounding us made the night sky beautiful and dark. It was so far in the country that you never saw any aircraft ever in the sky. One night I was sleeping and was woken up by a loud deep rumble. It was so deep I could feel my chest vibrating. I got up thinking it was an earthquake. I was in a bunk bed, so I got up to wake my cousin up on the top bunk. He wouldn't wake up. I shook him and turned him in his bed and nothing. At this point I'm super scared, so I went next door to my aunt's room to wake her up. I shook her and even turned her in her bed and she didn't respond. The rumbling just kept on. I got back into the bed and put the sheets over my head and just closed my eyes hoping it would stop. Next thing I know, it's morning. I wake up confused about the night before and ask everyone if they heard the loud rumble last night. No one heard anything. I really believe it was aliens, man. I get sleep paralysis anywhere from 2 to 10 times a month, and for those who don't know what it is, essentially you can't move, you're awake, but in a dreamlike state, and it is hell. My normal experiences usually consist of dark humanoid figures, especially one in the very corner of my room, whom I have nicknamed the Creeper, because every time I move my eyes, it creeps closer, and closer, and closer, until it is standing over me at the edge of my bed. But that's not the worst part. I have sound hallucinations, and those are just the worst. I hear whispering of some made-up language, with bits of broken English in it, but I can never really make out what it is. Sometimes it's a low, rumbling growl right in my ear, and it's like I can feel the heat of someone's breath in my ear when it happens. My scariest experience was when the Creeper got far closer than usual, and much faster. It got to the point where it was sitting on my chest, with its face up to mine, and all I could see was pitch black straight in front of my eyes. But my peripheral vision wasn't blocked. It slowly backed away from my face, then started that horrid growling sound. It then stroked my face, and its elongated fingers were ice cold. This went on for a few minutes before it crept off me and scuttled up my wall to the ceiling over me, then melted into the darkness of night. Now it just stops at the edge of my bed. But, the second I could move that night, I noped out of my room and sobbed over a bowl of cereal. I didn't sleep for days. When I was young, my family and I were vacationing in Hilton Head, South Carolina. Excited to be at the beach, my brothers and I changed our clothes and stormed the beach. One of my favorite things to do was to swim out as far as I can so I wasn't able to touch the sea floor, wait out there a while, then swim back in. It was getting around dusk and I was out waiting a distance from the shore. Suddenly something bumped my legs. Once, twice, 3 times. Then something long and smooth brushed up against me. It was dark enough that you couldn't see below the surface. Once I thought it was safe, I swam back to shore as fast as I could swim. The next day, less than a mile from where we were staying, there was a shark attack. To this day I don't go in the ocean above my chest. When I was 6, I was in my back garden with my mom. My mom said that she heard the postman and went to get the post. About 3 seconds later I heard this weird croaky voice saying, "Carry on." Turns out as my mom was looking at the post, she found and read a letter saying my grandpa was dead. When I was about 9 or 10, my dad turned the basement into a room for me. Awesome. Anyways, I woke up at twice, both in the dead of night, and I could vividly see this animated figure. However, it seemed more or less like fog, not human-shaped. I had both smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Its movements, and how it flowed/hovered towards me was scary shit, and I pulled my blanket over my face, shut my eyes tight, and started to pray fast. After a minute of this, I'd muster up the courage to pull back the covers. Thank God it was gone. The second time happened maybe months or a year later. Each time was beyond scary, but I never told my parents, figuring they would see it as a scared 10-year-old living in the basement. Another time, I was at a friend's house playing video games. He has a stack of newspapers tied up on the kitchen table. They were 2 stacks, about 24 inches in height. No pets, no open windows. Both stacks were knocked over with slight force, as if they were swatted. My friend started to laugh and said it was his Uncle John, died in the house in the 70s, family believes he hangs around. I was walking by a cornfield and the corn started rustling really hard and I thought it was a coyote or something based on the sounds it was making. Anyway, I ran back home because I didn't want to get attacked by whatever it was. I went back the next day and all of the corn where the sound was coming from was dead on the ground. Not dead like just knocked over, dead like there was a circle of blackened corn stalks on the ground. I to this day have no idea what it could have been. I'm assuming it's a demon or something of the like. Recently I was standing in line to send a money transfer at the grocery store with my boyfriend. Out of my peripheral, I see someone standing to my right, not moving. I could tell they were looking at me, so I turned to look at whoever it was. It was an old man. He smiled at me, looked me up and down, and said, "Those are going to look great on your tombstone," referring to my legs, I guess. I was wearing a skirt, and walked away. I was dumbfounded as to how to respond and super creeped out. Our son was about a week old, and I had gotten up in the middle of the night to feed him formula. I'm the devil, I know, so my wife could sleep. He wasn't settling down, so I brought him in the bed with us to let him sleep on my chest. I nodded off after a bit and all of a sudden it felt like a cacophony of women's voices screamed at me, "You're killing him." I woke with a start and found my son had rolled off and fell in between me and my wife, face down between the pillows. Had I stayed asleep, death was a high probability for the little guy as he was all swaddled and couldn't move. The only thing I've ever experienced I can't really explain, and I'm one skeptical dude. When I was a kid, 13 or so, we had a snow day and I fell asleep in pretty early. I had this weird dream that I was helping a friend shovel her driveway with her parents, then we went across the street and helped their elderly neighbors shovel their driveway too. I woke up right after, and called my friend. This was exactly what she was doing while I was dreaming it. I was in my bed, reading a book when I suddenly noticed a red dot, like a laser pointer, moving on the wall. This isn't creepy or unexplainable in itself, but the fact that it was at a place where no laser pointer could have made that angle from any of the windows made me go wonder just what was going on. Never found an explanation. Growing up we had this big tree on our front lawn. Probably the biggest tree on the block. After living there for a few years the tree was gone. It hadn't been chopped down or anything, it just wasn't there. I had to be 8 or 9 when I was leaving for school and noticed it. There was no indication that the ground had been disturbed. The parts of the sidewalk where the roots used to push up were flat. When I got home I asked my mom about it and she said I was being silly and that we don't have a tree. I didn't bring it up much after that and kind of just accepted it, but when I think back about it now I can remember that tree so vividly. I remember carving into it. I remember the sap that used to drip out one side. I remember tripping on the sidewalk where the roots pushed it up. A little backstory, my sister claimed her house was haunted, balls rolling out from under beds without anything around to push them, even finding a bite mark in the soap in the shower. They even got the bite mark examined and it was the bite of a 8 or 9-year-old. Anyway, back to me. I was sleeping on her couch in the living room. The kitchen and living room were conjoined. Her cat was sleeping on top of the couch above my head and I woke up because he started doing the throat growl that they do when intimidated. I heard glasses moving in the kitchen so I thought my sister was up. I roll over and from the outside light shining through the kitchen window I saw the glasses moving on the counter. No one was there. I lost it and ran to my sister's room and slept next to her and my brother-in-law. I was 16. I'm from a super small town in the Midwest. Population 6,000. Not much bad shit ever happened there so basically everyone in town left their doors unlocked, or just usually didn't lock them, anyway. We would usually lock our front door deadbolt at night, but never our back door. Our backyard was fenced, but the gate wasn't locked, and our back door didn't have a deadbolt and was one of those that you could still open from the inside when it was locked, so you could really easily lock yourself out. So we just never, ever locked it. Anyway, I was like 9 or 10 years old? And I was still pretty afraid of the dark, so I didn't often leave the comfort of my bed at night, even to get up to go pee. But on this particular night I got up, wandered around the house. I remember it being really bright from the moon, drank some milk out of the jug in the fridge, sorry, Mom, and then before I went back to bed, I locked the back door. I remember thinking, I have to unlock it in the morning or Dad will get locked out and he'll be really mad at me. Anywho, that night one of the neighborhood kids was messed up on meth, going from house to house through the alleyways and just walking into people's houses through their back doors and emptying their medicine cabinets. He hit several houses on our block until an old lady down the street caught him in the act, and he attacked her with a knife. She was hospitalized and survived, but had to move into a nursing home afterwards. I don't know if he attempted to get into our house that night. I do know that our next door neighbors got their shit stolen. I remember hearing my parents talk about realizing the back door was locked and how lucky we were. They didn't know how it got locked, and figured it was just like an accident, or it had been locked for a few days and they just didn't realize it. I distinctly remember my dad saying, "Well, the fates must have been looking out for us last night." I didn't fully understand what that meant until years later, and I never did tell my parents it was me who locked the door that night. When I was 7 or 8, I was sleeping on the couch and in the middle of the night awoke to what can best be described as 3 cherubs flying around in a circle about 5 feet above my head. I was terrified. I closed my eyes and didn't reopen them for fear that they would know that I was awake or saw them. I somehow went back to sleep, 30+ years later, and I have no explanation as to what I saw. I'm not now or have ever been religious. I've only ever told one person I know about it. Needless to say, but every time I see art with cherubs or cupids around Valentine's Day I can't help thinking about that weird event. Noticed a spider in my locker at the gym. Didn't say a word to the staff. About an hour later that day, I went to retrieve my clothes after a long exhausting workout. That spider must have had babies, because there was all over my Puma hoodie. Well, fast forward today, that was last week, the spider had more babies and they had shut down the gym to sterilize it. If only I let them know last week. This past summer some guy would walk around my backyard late at night, whistle and pace around. He would leave after a few minutes. Never figured that out. Even creepier, I never could see his face cause he always wore dark clothes. Once, when I was about 22 years old, I was driving home from my university at about 10 p.m. I was alone, wasn't terribly tired, hadn't been drinking. I was stopped at a stoplight and happened to glance in the back seat. Sitting there was a sad-looking, great old man. White hair, thin face, gray suit, and dusty-looking. He was staring out the driver's side window. Of course I immediately freak out, look back again, and the man has disappeared. By this time, the light has changed and I'm hightailing it out of there. I am super wigged out and on ultra high alert when all of a sudden it occurs to me to look out the window to my left. On the side of the road, I see an 18-wheeler parked on the side of the road and the driver with a gun. I slam on my gas pedal and get out of the area. The next morning, after a half-dozen panicked phone calls and almost zero sleep, I flip on the news only to find that the trucker had actually blown his own head off in the cab of the truck and the police were investigating. I actually told this story to a pal of mine who is into some kind of spiritualism and she believes the man in the gray might be my spirit guide, and he was trying to keep me from being harmed or disturbed by such a nasty event. Either way, I never took the river road home again. When I was around 6 or 7, I had a beaded turtle pendant on a thin plastic rope. It was about the size of a quarter, had a thin plastic center and was covered in a soft, tan leather. Its shell was embroidered with red and white beading. I wore it every day and at the end of the night I hung it on an ET statue my mom had made in ceramics class. One night while I was sleeping I awoke to a weird noise. I peeked out from under the covers to see the notorious dust monster in the hallway. You know, that figure you see in total darkness that you can just make out the outline of. It was clearly a large male figure and he walked into my room. He didn't seem to notice that I'd tucked the blanket around me so he couldn't get me. I heard his footsteps next to me. I built the courage to peek an eye out to see who it was. I still couldn't make out who he was. He was big. He was tall, had long hair and very broad shoulders. He was on the right side of my bed, next to my desk. He reached over and took something. He then turned around and walked out of my room and went down the hallway. I dared not turn on the light. I was safer under my blankets and all I needed was a tight retuck. I reinforced my barrier and fell asleep. In the morning my necklace was gone. I looked everywhere with no luck. My whole family helped with no luck. I told them about the man that came in my room and that I was sure he took it. They didn't believe me, but surprisingly no one made fun of me either. My mom told me when I got older that the pendant was handmade on a reservation my grandparents had visited. I like to think he came back for it for some reason. I always had dreams of a little girl haunting my house. Never talked about it. But one day my mom mentioned seeing a little girl walking down the hallway one night, and me and my sister both looked up, and we all looked at each other slowly, confirming that we all had these suspicions about this same little girl haunting our home. A few weeks later our neighbor randomly says mid-conversation that there was a little girl buried in my backyard years and years ago before the blocks were packed with homes. I was in high school when this happened. At the time I lived alone with my mom and little sister. One evening I got out of bed in the middle of the night to get a glass of water. Went to the kitchen, poured a glass, then happened to turn and glance at the window above the sink. Someone was standing right outside, staring at me. He ducked out of view so fast I wasn't able to get a good look at his face. I not so wisely ran out the back door to see who it was. But there was no one there. He must have ran off. I like to tell myself that it was probably one of my friends screwing around. But I can't help but worry it was something more sinister. I can't recall too much since it was a dream, but when I was younger I can remember one in particular. I was having a bad dream and I was paralyzed, couldn't move my body, couldn't make a sound. Something bad, some evil was coming my way and I couldn't do a thing about it. I managed to force myself to open my eyes. It took a ton of effort to do so, and when I finally did I felt all this heavy weight, still paralyzed, still unable to talk. I kinda forced my way out, like being wrapped like a mummy and busting out like the Incredible Hulk. My mouth open, letting out and Schwarzenegger like arg, and everything felt normal. I can't make any sense of it, but it felt like I was still in a dream. A live dream, but it was reality. I can't explain it. I get sleep paralysis a lot, usually when I don't get enough sleep. I've had lots of really creepy experiences. One Sunday after a long weekend I went up to my room early enough to lie down. I had kicked in straight away, started hallucinating and was paralyzed. I get it so much that I don't really freak out anymore and just wait to see what happens, but this time was way too creepy for me. There was a naked woman with long hair standing beside me about a meter away from my bed with her head hanging down looking at her feet. She was beautiful as far as I could make out, that was until she looked up suddenly and her skin went gray and melted and her hair turned to that of a 100-year-old. I freaked out and woke myself up. I cannot describe how real the whole experience was. Another time I woke, in a state where you're half awake and half dreaming, in the middle of the night, and there was a 7-foot-tall and relatively thin shadow man looking over me at the end of my bed. He slowly and silently walked to the side of my bed and sat down to my left-hand side. I said to myself, it's only a dream, close your eyes and he will disappear, so I did, for about 5 seconds. When I opened them he was in the exact same position, but I could see his head tilt towards my direction. Again I freaked out and woke myself. Later I looked it up and found that many people see these same characters during sleep paralysis. The Shadow Man and Old Hag. Look it up, it's freaky shit. I saw my grandpa 4 months or so after he died rocking back and forth in his favorite chair in my grandma's living room. His hair was completely white before he passed. When I saw him his hair was literally glowing like neon white. I was 8 or 9 when this happened. This is a very poorly written story about my experience using a Ouija board. My cousin, who I will start calling Jill, and I were talking on the phone one night and messaging each other on MySpace at the same time. I don't know why, that's just something we did when we weren't together since we were best friends. Anyway, since we were talking on landlines we could easily hear what was going on in the background of the other person. While I was talking to Jill, she got more and more frightened as the night went on. She refused to get off the phone with me because she was home alone and creepy stuff was already happening before I left her house that day. We had been playing with a homemade Ouija board all week. The first thing I heard was someone banging on the front door. I knew that's where she was since the computer she was using to message me at the time was right next to the front door to her house. She looked. Nobody was outside for miles. Later on, Jill was in the bathroom, with me still on the other line, when I heard very, Very loud thumps in the background. She opened the door that was right next to the staircase and all of a sudden I heard the thumps again but quicker and got louder with each bump. She screamed and cried and begged me to come get her. At this time, the phone was cutting out horribly and I could barely hear her. One of the many things that happened frequently, we asked the entity to knock it off and it would instantly start working again. As she locked herself up back in the bathroom, I got a message on MySpace from her computer. It said she isn't leaving and I lost my shit. I messaged back and said something along the lines of "leave us the hell alone." I don't quite remember my exact words. We had a short, angry conversation but I vaguely remember it and it bothers me more than it should. Jill very suddenly went from manic to calm, which was terrifying to me. The phone was no longer cutting out and her MySpace messenger said all fixed. She said in a weird voice that everything was fine and that she was going to get off the phone and go to sleep. Her mom told me the next morning Jill was on the couch screaming pyro over and over until her mom woke her up. She was holding the phone with about 5 feet of duct tape on it. To this day, Jill doesn't remember what happened after the thumping on the stairs. Don't play with Ouija boards, kids. When I was about 5/6 of a year/so, my brother and I were playing with pickup sticks. We were inside our room and the door was closed. A stick rolled up under the door and ended outside the room. To our surprise, the stick was flung back inside the room like someone flicked it under the door. We were amused and so we flung several sticks under the door and they were all flung back at us. Though it was just one of our parents, but when we opened the door we were the only ones inside the house. Back when I used to live with my folks, I was upstairs in my room when I heard my mom shout from downstairs, "Goose, it's time for dinner." I had made myself something earlier so I shouted back that it's fine. I then realized that was impossible for my mom to call as there was no one in the house and my parents were in another country on holiday and it was 9 p.m. So this freaked me out. It got worse however when the voice, still sounding like my mother, shouted from downstairs, "Well, I will just come and say goodnight," and there were very heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. They got to my door, the handle rattled, my dog, who slept on the floor of my room, started growling, which he never did, then everything went quiet and the dog calmed down, left me extremely spooked. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share and we will see you in the next video.